But maybe this leads into TJ Hockenson. At least it does for me. Because I didn't believe that the Minnesota Vikings would have a really valuable fantasy tight end. We saw what happened with Kyle Rudolph all those years ago. He was always like, I guess if you're desperate. Irv Smith never panned out the way that people wanted Irv Smith to pan out when he was the guy on the Vikings. And then TJ Hockenson gets traded. I'm probably said it on this episode or on this podcast, like I'm out. I'm out on TJ Hockenson. I don't trust it. Is this sample size enough for you to trust him next year?
Yes.
Yeah. You're lying.
Here's why. Because both Detroit and Minnesota had a stud wide receiver, Justin Jefferson, Amon-Ra St. Brown.
Yeah.
Very good running backs. Swift, Dalvin Cook. Very non-flashy quarterback in Cousins and Goff. Offensive line, probably a little bit of a downgrade for Minnesota as opposed to Detroit, but it's not like Minnesota's offensive line is terrible by any means. So when you start looking at like offensive weapons versus offensive weapons, it's fairly comparable. I think you can make the argument that they're fairly comparable. It comes down to scheme and coaching, really, at that point, and execution of plays. Well, obviously, as I said earlier, Minnesota had a plan for him. They wanted him, and they executed that, and they made him a focal point of that offense. Whereas in Detroit, for whatever reason, he was just never a focal point of that offense, even after being highly drafted as he was.
Yeah, I think to your point, and maybe what we're talking about of the hierarchy of targets and depth charts and all that, maybe it doesn't really matter. Maybe all that matters is what do they think about this tight end? Is the tight end good enough that they're like, we're going to make sure to work you into the game plan? Because if you're not, none of this matters. None of it's relevant. And I think what my mental block was when he was with Detroit, it just felt like maybe he's not that great of a tight end. Maybe he's not the prospect everybody thought that he was.
Absolutely.
He's not showing it in Detroit, especially when there weren't that many options to throw to like last year. And he just wasn't doing it. But it's all about the scheme. It's all about the coaching, like you said. So I do think that's interesting. And I do think that TJ Hockenson might as well be Travis. He's almost as good.
Maybe TJ is short for Travis. Maybe it's like Travis James.
God. I hope so. Travis James Hockenson, the fourth, is going to be on my radar for sure next year. I just hope that it doesn't bite me in the ass. It could.
Here's the thing with him, though. Even though he finished as tight end 2 overall, come redraft next year, people are not going to remember that he finished tight end 2. They're going to remember that he had some very big games. Like he had a couple like 40-point games, one with Detroit and like one with Minnesota, which I think really helped bump up his stats for the season. But no one's going to remember he finished that well. They're going to be like, oh yeah, he had a good season. He was, a mid-range tight end 1, because there's still that stigma of him in Detroit. And like I said, I just think next year you're going to be able to get him. You're not going to have to pay up for him. Let's put it that way. Where if you're going to lump him in the tier with Kittle and Pitts and Andrews and Waller, those guys, you're not going to have to. He's probably going to be at the bottom of that tier where you're going to be able to get him at the end of that run of tight ends and not have to pay up for them.
Yeah, and I do think Kittle and Andrews will probably be ahead of him in ADP. Almost
for sure.
And then
it might be a competition.
It might be a thing of Waller versus him in that range. Like that might be the situation we find in redraft. So for Dynasty then, TJ Hawkinson's pretty young. He's a young fella. And if we're looking at like third year breakouts, and if we want to consider that he is essentially, well, I guess it would be his fourth year, but he's still super young. So is TJ Hockenson headlining your trade targets for tight ends if you're looking for one in Dynasty?
Yes. Actually, I was, I know we were talking about it here Sunday when we were golfing, trying to make a trade in one of my leagues. And I was trying to get Hockenson because I do believe that this is the real deal. Like he's going to be he's never gonna no one's ever gonna be the Kelsey level as long as Kelsey's in the league. Um,
Right.
but he is someone you can rely on week in and week out, kind of a set it and forget it. He's gonna give you a very solid floor, and then you've seen the spike weeks from him where he can go off for, like, 150 yards and 2 touchdowns. You'll have those weeks occasionally. Yeah, I mean, what's not to like about that?